All but 3 of Africa's 55 countries have agreed to form one of the world's largest free trade areas. And now that Gambia's ratified the deal, it can be put into effect. But Nigeria isn't on board, and without Africa's largest economy, what chance does the agreement have? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine. Now, it's often difficult to do business in Africa. The World Bank ranks many countries there among the hardest places to sell goods and services. But an ambitious project to ease trade between them is now a step closer to reality. The African Union agreed last year to create a free trade zone on the continent, the largest since the World Trade Organization was formed. On Tuesday, Gambia became the 22nd country to ratify the accord, reaching the threshold for it to be implemented. It's hoped the deal will reduce tariffs and trade rules and create jobs for a market of 1.2 billion people. So who signed up to this then? Well, 52 of the 55 African Union members have endorsed the deal. The 22 countries here in orange, they've ratified it. 3 countries, though, they haven't signed up at all. They are Benin, Eritrea and, most importantly, Nigeria, and you can see them in grey. Now, Nigeria, as you know, is Africa's largest economy. All right, let's introduce our guests now. From Nairobi, we have Aly-Khan Satchu, CEO of Rich Management and an emerging markets economist. From Abidjan in the Ivory Coast, we have Stephen Yeboah, a co-founder of Commodity Monitor. And from London, we have Olusegun Okubanjo, founder and managing partner of OBSIDIAN, a finance firm focusing on East, West and Central Africa. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us. Can I start with you then, Olusegun, in London? First of all, tell us, why do you think Nigeria, Africa's largest economy, is not taking part in this free trade deal?
Thanks, Martine. I think that it's wise for the government, or for any government, to consider this carefully. I think Nigeria choosing not to participate immediately is presented as quite wise.
But it's been 5 years in the making, Olusegun, and it was only in 2018, I believe, that President Buhari decided not to take part. I mean, he just didn't turn up for the meeting in Kigali.
I think there's something you said when you were introducing the show, that there's a hope that this free trade area will reduce tariffs and potentially create jobs. I'm not necessarily convinced that reducing tariffs will create jobs. And it makes sense for countries that are looking to grow and industrialize certain key sectors of their economies to have the tool of tariffs to be able to do that.
All right.
I'm also not yet convinced that...
no, please carry on.
I'm also not yet convinced that the priorities of one country, say in Nigeria, are similar to the priorities of another.
OK, well, that's interesting. Stephen, in Abidjan, I think you're quite an ardent proponent of this free trade area. What do you think about what Olusegun has pointed out, that there's a huge disparity between the economies in Africa, and that Nigeria is actually rather wise to hold back and think about it more closely?
Right, thanks, Martine. For me, I've definitely be an optimist, when looking at the whole agreement is concerned. And for me, I mean, Olusegun has a case. Definitely in such an agreement, there will be some losers and there will be some winners. But overall, what we have to consider is that this agreement, which is historic, actually, it signals, a new era. And this era is actually to make sure that we change the structures of Africa's economies. So when you talk about the whole, structure of Africa's economy, Nigeria, for example, actually, is less diversified because it depends so much on oil. as government revenues. So when a trade, such an agreement actually expands, further opportunities. So for me, what I see is actually a win-win situation. And if there are countries to fear, that they will lose from this agreement, it has to be the smaller countries and not a bigger country or a bigger economy like Nigeria. And for me, looking at agriculture, for example, Nigeria still imports a lot of its food, and this is an opportunity actually to expand and make sure that we can produce more what we eat locally.
Let's go to the other side of the continent now, to the east, and Aly-Khan Satchu, who's in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Aly-Khan, what do you make of the arguments that we've heard so far? It's been pointed out that there's a vast difference in terms of the needs of the various economies on the continent. And in fact, Olusegun has pointed out that he's not entirely sure that reducing tariffs is necessarily going to lead to this creation of jobs that has been stated as one of the main objectives of this exercise.
So just on the jobs point, Martine, we've got to create about 17 million jobs a year at the moment, and we're doing nothing of the sort. The Nigerian model currently is in the slow lane and is not even able to produce a per capita GDP increase. It's actually declining year on year when you factor in the population increase. So I think, Nigeria is not necessarily the economic model that we should be looking at. At a macro level, I think this is a unique blank slate, blue sky opportunity. It's a $3 trillion market. Our people are entrepreneurial. If you go anywhere in Africa, you will find markets. And I think so at the macro scale, I think it's a uniquely good thing. At the micro scale, at unleashing our entrepreneurs on the ground, I think it's a great idea. The problem is there are going to be many reactionary forces who are benefiting from what is an asymmetric information and economic space across this continent. And it's created a feedback loop, and particularly one can look at things like we spend $63 billion on food imports. But this is where people make enormous windfall profits, and you get it recirculating through the political system. And essentially what this free trade proposal is going to do, if it really works, Martine, it's going to really re-engineer the African economy. And there are a lot of people who are very powerful, are not very keen on being re-engineered out of what is a very profitable position that's been in existence for many, many years. So I think overall, this is something we need to embrace. There will be...
Thank you, Aly-Khan.
Sorry.
Let's put that straight back to Olusegun in London, because clearly Aly-Khan there is suggesting that it's actually vested interests that might be against any changes that this free trade area will put in place, which he contends will liberalise what he calls an African economy, not just the 55 individual states.
The lofty ideas are great, but I'm not... If you look at countries, the example of food security, if you look at countries like Nigeria that have made great strides in improving their capacity to produce food in country to meet their local demand, they've mostly been able to achieve that using tariffs as a tool. And if you look at the EPA agreements that the EU has signed with many African countries, such as Ghana, you have a situation where it's more expensive to grow chickens in Ghana than it is to grow chickens in Europe. And as a result, this country is unable to compete, and you have less food security. So I think we can't oversimplify this. It's a lofty idea, and I agree with the emotive drivers. But if you look at the economics of it, if Africa is to develop and advance, it has to do so in a way that governments can achieve their priority objectives using the tools they have available to them, which include tariffs,
yes,
as has been the case in every other region.
But Olusegun, Aly-Khan has already pointed out that the Nigerian model is certainly not one to be following, is it, at the moment, importing a vast amount of its own food. It's got more people living in poverty than any other country in the world, recently overtaking India, and has perhaps the largest city in the world, if not now, pretty soon. Lagos will be the largest city in the world, and unemployment is enormous.
I think that focusing on those issues it makes sense to point those out, but the Nigerian model this isn't simplified down to the challenges you identify. The question is, what are the tools necessary to drive development and grow economic activity in Africa? And is this free trade area ultimately going to achieve that? And I think there's a fair concern to say that, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the text, but if you review the text, you can see that countries will find themselves, countries like Nigeria or Ghana or Kenya, will find themselves in an environment where they're essentially one of 54 countries voting, theoretically, to agree to trade deals or non-trade deals with parties like the European Union that are hyper-competitive. You can envision scenarios where parties, foreign companies or non-African companies come into markets like Ethiopia, establish operations, and then produce highly competitive products into these other markets because now they have free access.
Right.
So who's best positioned to take advantage of this? The small entrepreneur that he was mentioning earlier, or the large corporation? And the truth is, governments should retain this tool so that they can drive development in the priority sectors for each government, which differs for different governments.
Right. Stephen, what does this free trade arrangement mean for the country you're in at the moment, Côte d'Ivoire, one of the first to sign up to this deal?
Yes, for me, I think there is a common, I would say, mistake that we make in terms of seeing, how we view the agreement. And for me, what I always say is that the agreement is not an end in itself; it's a means, And for me, the continent actually has for so long, engaged in trading raw commodities. So this for me is an opportunity to push for a manufactured, a change in this commodity trading.
Stephen, please, how does this free trade arrangement and the reduction of tariffs, how does that necessarily stimulate local manufacturing? Because, of course, Africa is renowned for not adding value to the raw materials that leave the continent. But how does reducing tariffs actually stimulate the local manufacturing sector?
So let's take, for example, the agriculture sector. So, in 2015, Africa actually imported, about $65 billion, worth of agriculture produce. So let's say, this is actually grown locally. This is where we can have people, growing wheat and actually, going ahead, along the value chain to process the wheat and to use for other products. So this is actually, a good case, to make sure that we do, engage in more manufacturing. And also, if you look at the trade, the trade regime in the Africa region for the moment, Africa actually traded among itself, and manufacturing actually was the largest compared to, the non-manufactured products we traded outside the continent. And this, I think, for me, is a good starting point, to make sure that the agreement, for example, is to increase intra-regional trade within the region, the Africa region. And this is also, definitely will have a direct link to manufactured products that we trade among ourselves as Africans. So this, for me, offers, an important, catalyst to make sure that we have manufactured products traded, within and outside the continent.
Okay, Aly-Khan, if Asia trades at 59% among its fellow Asian nations, European nations trade at 69% among themselves, Africa is only at 20% at the moment. Given the implementation of the free trade deal at this particular stage, with 22 countries now having ratified it, what sort of improvement on that figure would you expect to see, say, within a year?
I think we'd see a huge improvement. I think, it's essentially been suppressed. And if you create a level playing field in a number of countries for us to exploit these opportunities, I think you're going to see a tremendous surge. It's not just about trade, it's about the movement of our human capital, that it's not just stuck, that it becomes much more mobile. It reminds me of a famous quote by Norman Tebbit a Conservative minister in Britain who said, you know, get on your bike if you need to find a job. I remember many years ago. It creates more mobility across the continent at the micro level. At the macro level, I don't think we should fear foreign multinationals. We understand our brothers and sisters markets much better than foreign multinationals necessarily do. We have many emerging Pan-African champions who are exploiting these opportunities. And to the previous point, intra-African trade is 4x in terms of sophistication in the product than it is when you compare it with exports that go to the global market. So that is also a big pull effect that your previous speaker was mentioning. I think, you know, we've got to think more Pan-African. We've got to stop being in our bunkers. We've got to stop fearing change. This is a very big opportunity. The economic add to GDP will be beyond people's wildest dreams. And I think the time has come. You know, these big trends through the mobile phone have connected all of us in a way. We've got the infrastructure going in now. Otherwise, if we don't have a single market, all this infrastructure is basically wasted. Today, I can drive on a road from Nairobi to Addis Ababa that didn't exist before. To not talk about a free market in the context of the investments that we are making on this continent is really a non sequitur, in my view. We do have to move very aggressively against entrenched forces because they've had a wonderful position for very long and they have a lot of capital. But move we have to, we've got to do it now. And the devil will be in the detail on the ground at the border posts. What happens there?
Aly-Khan is clearly an Afro-optimist, aren't you, Aly-Khan? Going back to Olusegun, Afro-pessimists will point out capacity is one of Africa's main problems. What about the prospect of those more developed manufactured economies, like, say, in North Africa, Tunisia, Morocco, for instance, overwhelming some of those that are less developed on the manufacturing side, for instance, Nigeria or perhaps Zambia, for example? Isn't there the possibility of the disparity between the two being widened?
Martine, I think that's absolutely right. I want to push back on a label that you just mentioned. I'm not an Afro-pessimist. I'm actually a very, very, very passionate Afro-optimist. And I think because I believe in the capacity of African nations, I think that they should have the ability to use the tools, the best tools available to them to drive development. And so you're right. If this free trade area is created as envisaged, you'll find countries competing in areas where they're hyper-competent. And that hyper-competency in the continent does not extend to food security, which has been mentioned. So I don't see Africa suddenly becoming a net exporter of food as a result of signing this agreement. And nothing prevents African countries from importing food from each other in areas where they have capacity or competition. What you'll see instead is the stronger markets, including markets like Nigeria in some areas, competing more aggressively, more benefiting from this free trade area. And to say that one shouldn't be concerned about non-African actors taking advantage of a free market, bringing hyper-competitive ability to bear in a market, isn't something to be concerned about, is to me concerning, because that's the reason, one of the reasons why Africa hasn't developed as quickly at the pace that the continent would like. But I'll say this as well.
Sorry.
If you use an example.
Let me interrupt you there.
If you use an example and use.
Sorry, Olusegun, let me interrupt you there, because you're taking us rather neatly onto the issue of FDI. You're suggesting that you're rather nervous about the introduction of foreign involvement, if you like, engagement in local African economies. But foreign direct investment is a necessary ingredient for growth. We've always been told this.
Of course. Foreign capital supporting African countries, African entrepreneurs, pursuing African opportunities is a key part of the growth story of the continent and any region that's developed. But foreign capital supporting foreign capitalists coming in to extract value, to externalize capital and profits from the continent is a counter supportive force. And that's what I'm concerned about. So I'm not averse to FDI. I think FDI is a key part of the story. But it should be FDI that supports private capital in Africa, and also that supports governments in the continent that are close to their people to understand what their priorities are.
Right.
The priority for Nigeria is not going to be the same as the priority for Uganda. They'll be different. And I don't think Uganda should subordinate its priorities to Nigeria's priorities.
Right.
I was going to mention earlier, the Dangote Group is one of the recent success stories of industrialization on the continent.
Right.
But the founder is opposed to this.
Oh,
Why?
is he?
If it's going to drive more industrialization, why would he be against this idea? So it sounds very nice, and it fits a high-level narrative and sounds romantic. But hard economics dictates that countries should have the levers to protect key sectors and drive the growth of key sectors.
Let me quickly jump in, because that's a very interesting point. Aly-Khan, I could see that you wanted to get in on that. Olusegun, they're suggesting that Dangote, one of the continent's most successful businessmen, is against this free trade project.
Of course he is. He's the biggest beneficiary of the existing information asymmetry and economic asymmetry. I mean, you know, he is a prime example. He's obviously a brilliant entrepreneur, but he's been very, very clever at manoeuvring within the environment that we're now trying to break, because of, one, capital formation, two, the context with which he's operating in. Now, I highly respect him, but he's naturally going to be in opposition to it, because this is where he gets these enormously wide profits in those businesses in which he's operating in. I mean, if you look at something like cement, the margins that he's got are about 3 times what the margins really should be. So I think that is a very clear-cut case. Going back to the issue of foreign companies coming here to extract opportunities and externalize capital, that's what's been going on under the current system. Take places like the DR Congo. It's not too difficult to see that is the correct characterization of the existing situation. The chief beneficiary, a foreign beneficiary of the current system, has been China.
Right.
So China, if you look at East Africa, for example, intra-EAC exports have been flat for 4 years. China's exports into East Africa have gone up 67%. So if we're trying to identify a particular issue, that is what the issue is.
Aly-Khan.
And then to say that, you know, we don't want to compete with our fellow Africans, I mean, that's not fair.
Stephen, let me take it back to you, and can you be brief, please, because sadly we're running out of time, which brings me back to capacity. It sounds exceedingly complicated, and my question to you is, do African governments, in the first instance, have the capacity to monitor and to implement this in order to protect themselves from some of the dangers that have been highlighted in our conversation today?
I mean, Martin, for me, if we are just opposing capacity and will, I would choose will. It definitely has to do with the political will of the African leaders. If this, I mean, this is a starting point. We are unleashing a unique potential, and this potential is to make sure that countries find their niche in terms of the whole production chain, and then to be able to take advantage. And competency, you know, the agreement will ensure that we build internal or regional competency where these countries can actually launch out, you know, into the global value chain. Otherwise, we stay within the continent, and actually we will never have the competence in terms of contributing to the global value chain. So for me, this is the opportunity, and it has to do with the political will of the African government and then the states. So this actually has to be done, and it's a call on us, you know, and then the African leaders to act beyond speeches and to make sure that they're able to practicalize all the rhetorics. So for me, afterwards, is to make sure that all the protocols, all the agreements are negotiated well, and definitely there should be a win-win situation.
And Olusegun, I'll give the last word to you. 30 seconds, I'm afraid. And I just quickly want to get your thoughts on whether this free trade agreement would actually have any kind of impact upon the existing arrangements, trading arrangements between the African continent, for the most part, and other trading blocs, like the EU, for instance. Will these arrangements be impacted?
Yes, they will. I think that the signatories to this free trade agreement will find themselves signing more aggressive economic partnership agreements, which will make it even more difficult and make some of the concerns that Aly-Khan and Stephen raise much more exaggerated. I think that they'll lose the ability, they'll have even less negotiating power as a group than they think they will, because ultimately, what is the expertise that we're bringing by creating this free trade area that you need tariffs usually to create? By giving up that tool, they will be exposed.
Can I thank you all very much indeed? Aly-Khan in Nairobi, Stephen in Abidjan, and Olusegun in London. Thank you all very much indeed for an interesting conversation, I hope you think. If you want to see it again, you can always go to the website, aljazeera.com. If you want even more discussion, you can go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And there's always the Twitter sphere. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. I'm @Martine Dennis from the whole team here in Doha. It's bye for now.